On this edition of Newsmakers, we're joined by the NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Two reporters on for the questioning for him. We're joined by Caleb Henry of Space News. He serves as a staff writer, and Space and Defense Industries reporter Christian Davenport of the Washington Post. Thanks for coming on, guys. Mr. Davenport, you start.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for joining us, Mr. Administrator.
Absolutely.
I thought I might start with the Space Force, even though, let's be clear, that's a military force that's under the Pentagon. You're the NASA Administrator. It's a civilian agency. But what does the creation, or what would the creation of a Space Force mean for NASA?
So NASA has, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets in orbit right now. Plus, we've got our American astronauts in orbit. So, obviously, we are dependent on space being safe and accessible, and that's important for the science we do, for the discovery and the exploration. And so I think that, I have been, as a member of Congress before I was the NASA Administrator, I've been a very strong supporter of a Space Corps, which is very similar to the Space Force. And we voted on it in the House of Representatives. I voted on it 3 times, twice in committee, once in the full House, and it actually passed the full House with 344 votes, which is, of course, a very big bipartisan vote. But at the end of the day, all of the technologies and capabilities that NASA develops, we want to commercialize those capabilities, and many of those capabilities have been commercialized. The space economy right now represents about $350 billion annually. That's a big economy, and the President has made a determination that it needs to be protected. Now, it is true, as you have said, the Air Force does this, and it's a national security mission. But there have been arguments that say, we don't want the space domain having to compete with the air domain. We need a separate force that can focus exclusively on space, given how important it is to the American way of life, and ultimately how it's becoming more contested every day.
Do you think that President Trump has mentioned NASA and the Space Force in the same tweet? Do you think that that confuses the general public about what the Space Force and NASA do?
So, there might be some confusion there, but the reality is the American space enterprise, of course, NASA is a big part of that, and so is commercial industry, and not just commercial industry in space, but when you think about the way we navigate, that affects the condition of humans on the Earth. So the way we navigate, the way we communicate, the way we produce food and energy, people are probably watching this on DirecTV or Dish Network. They could be watching it online, internet broadband from space. All that are services provided by space-based capabilities. The way we produce food in this country, the crop yields have increased because of space-based capabilities. The way we produce energy, the way we do disaster relief, national security, defense, predict weather, understand climate. And I think a lot of people don't realize that every banking transaction in this country requires a timing signal from GPS. Without GPS, there is no banking in this country. The power grid in this country requires timing from GPS to regulate the flows of electricity. When you think about cell towers, we need a timing signal from GPS in order for cell towers to work, and terrestrial networks as well. So there is no shortage of dependency by Americans on space. The question is, does that represent a vulnerability, and do we need to protect it? And the answer is yes and yes. And I think as NASA Administrator, I think it's important for me to talk about how space has transformed the human condition for the good because of a trail that was blazed by NASA. And if I can communicate that and let folks know that these capabilities are worth protecting, then I think that's a big piece of my job as the NASA Administrator. Now, I want to be really clear. NASA does not get involved in national security or defense. That's not what we do. We do science, we do discovery, we do exploration, but of course we have billions of dollars worth of assets, and we have astronauts, and we want to make sure that they're safe.
You mentioned the commercialization of space and the space economy and this growing space industry. And we've seen the rise of several high-profile companies, namely SpaceX and a company like Blue Origin that's coming along and building their own rockets. What does that industry mean for the role of NASA, and how is NASA's role going to evolve into the future with the rise of this industry?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I get that a lot just from the general public. A couple of things that are important to note. As NASA, we want to do more than we've ever been able to do before. And of course, this burgeoning commercial space industry enables us to do more. We're now resupplying the International Space Station with a commercial market. In essence, we don't purchase, own, and operate our own rockets to resupply the International Space Station. We, in essence, buy the service to resupply the International Space Station. And the reason that's important is because it drives down the cost to NASA. It increases our access to space. And you have multiple competitors out there that are competing on innovation, and they're competing on cost, which enables us we now see that we have reusable rockets that launch things into space and then come back and land, and then we can launch them again. That drives down the cost, and that innovation is possible because of a competitive marketplace. And so where NASA sees itself playing is if there are things that we can commercialize, things that we can buy as a service, then that enables us to do more. Where there is not a robust commercial marketplace, that's where NASA needs to be involved in traditional acquisition methods, where we purchase, own, and operate capabilities. But we also have to be aware that to the extent that those new capabilities, when I say new capabilities, right now there's not a big market to go to the moon. But there could be one day, and I believe there will be. And when that day occurs, we need to be thinking about NASA's role, which is to go further, to do more, to retire risk that can then be commercialized itself. So right now, we have retired risk in low Earth orbit. That enables commercial industry to take over, and we can be a customer. We want to retire that risk deeper into space, at the moon. Cislunar space is what we call it. And then eventually all the way to Mars. And if we can successfully do that, I think that's our mission.
Do you think that SpaceX and Blue Origin, since they're both building heavy launch vehicles, could one day obviate the need for NASA's Space Launch System?
So I get that question a lot as well. There's two things that are important to note. Number one, the Space Launch System and the Orion crew capsule are the two best opportunities we have to get into deep space the soonest. We've got hardware that is, under development. It's not just under development. It's like we've got hardware. You can go down to Michoud and you can go down to Marshall Space Flight Center, and you can actually touch, the rocket cores and the Orion crew capsule. You can go out to the Kennedy Space Center and you can touch it's there. Like we're almost ready. Now that being said, when you look at the horizon, who would have thought in the 1980s that we would be resupplying the International Space Station by buying a service from commercial industry? So when you think, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, even sooner, maybe, who knows? But if there is a way we can acquire that as a service at a lesser cost and enable us to use NASA's resources to do something else, do more to retire risk somewhere else, then we fully support that. NASA's goal is to do more than we've ever done before, and those commercial partners ultimately will enable us to do that.
At this stage, how confident are you to put humans in commercial spacecraft?
We are getting more and more confident every day, and as a matter of fact, next year, in 2019, less than a year from now, you're going to see American astronauts launching on American rockets from American soil, and those rockets are going to be acquired with a commercial contract. In other words, we're not going to purchase, own, and operate the rockets. We're acquiring the service. And those two commercial providers are Boeing and SpaceX. Now, Boeing's launch provider is United Launch Alliance, and Boeing provides the capsule, and SpaceX is using their own rocket and their own capsule.
Well, there are two other companies actually that are aimed at flying humans off the face of the Earth, Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic,
Yes.
although not to orbit, and they would do this as a commercial venture for tourists. I wonder, as NASA administrator and as you are working toward flying NASA astronauts for the first time since the shuttle retired in 2011, does it bother you that these other companies actually might fly humans first, or do you think that's actually a really good thing?
Oh, it's a wonderful thing. So you mentioned Virgin Galactic and you mentioned Blue Origin, and They're looking in short order on doing suborbital space flights, not just for science, which is important, but also for tourism. The more people we can get exposed to space, I think the better. And ultimately, when those capabilities become commercialized, it results in a market that enables NASA to buy those services as well. Then NASA becomes one customer of many customers, driving down our cost, increasing our access, and then again we can use taxpayer resources to do things that commercial isn't yet doing. So all of that, in my view, is very good.
So one of your commercial crew providers, Boeing, you mentioned that they're using a vehicle from United Launch Alliance that's powered by a Russian engine, and I believe Russia has made recent statements indicating that they may cut the supply of that engine. Does that concern you, that might cause further delays with NASA's commercial crew program?
Yes, in fact, the United States of America is working really hard to not be dependent on the RD-180 engine. It's also true, and I want to be really clear about this, NASA is unique from the rest of the federal government in the sense that when relations get rough between countries, when they're not so good, NASA is able to maintain that relationship. So right now we have American astronauts on the International Space Station that got there by flying on a Russian Soyuz rocket, and of course that's an amazing relationship that is unique to NASA, and that's historical as well. So when I was in Congress, we passed a sanctions bill on Russia, and of course it was signed by the president. During that time, specifically, space was carved out because we want to be able to continue to cooperate on space issues. So NASA represents an amazing soft power capability for the United States of America. When other channels of communication break down, nations can still communicate on space exploration and space discovery and science. And I think that's an amazing capability that NASA needs to preserve. So do we want to be dependent? No. Do we want to have a partnership? Absolutely. And even when we have commercial crew, which is an American rocket launching from American soil with American astronauts, which we want to, at the same time, maintain the relationship with Russia. So maybe some of their crew will launch on our rockets and our crew will launch on their rockets. The International Space Station is truly international. And it needs to remain that way.
NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine joining us for this conversation on Newsmakers. Caleb Henry, go ahead.
Follow-up question just on that. So the head of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, Dmitry Rogozin, I believe that he is banned by U.S. sanctions from visiting the U.S. Have you met with him?
Not yet, but I intend to in the near future. And we're working on how do we maintain this relationship given those constraints. And I'm very confident that we'll be able to work it out.
Question about the commercial crew program, Boeing and SpaceX flying NASA's astronauts to the space station. They've recently announced new dates for when their first flights without crew and with crew.
Yeah.
I believe the crewed flights would be April 2019 for SpaceX, mid-2019 for Boeing. There have been repeated delays, though, and setbacks in the program. Are you confident that they're going to fly now on those dates? And if so, what gives you that confidence?
So we are confident. We did not, when you think about what commercial crew is, we did not write out, thousands of requirements and specifications for commercial crew. We do have requirements, don't get me wrong, but we wanted to provide as much leeway to the companies as possible to create their own unique designs and to be very innovative, and they have. Now, to the extent that has enabled us, it's really kind of advanced technology, it's enabled us to do more. We also have to make sure that those designs are very safe. And so that's what we're working through right now. We're trying to figure out every possible way that these rockets could fail and then mitigate against those risks. And so that takes time. It's also true, and this is an important point to make, commercial crew rockets and capsules are going to be at least 3 times safer than the space shuttles. So when we talk about the amount of risk that we're taking here, commercial crew actually reduces the risk to American astronauts and our international partners. I think that's an important point to make.
Why is that?
It's an entirely different design. When you think about the space shuttles, there was no crew escape capability. There was no, in essence, when you think about it, a fighter aircraft with an ejection seat, there was no ejection capability on the space shuttles, and of course that resulted in more risk. And the design of the space shuttle itself was more risky than a simple rocket with a capsule on top. Now, I don't want to use the word simple because rockets are never simple, but it's a much simpler design than the space shuttle was. So the simpler design combined with a crew ejection capability, if you will, a crew escape capability, really increases the survivability and reduces the risk.
Mr. Henry.
So the Senate has proposed in the Space Frontier Act to extend the life of the International Space Station 6 years to 2030, which is beyond initial extensions to 2024 and possibly 2028. What do you think of this?
It's an interesting idea. I'll tell you what my position is and what the position of the administration is that we need to very rapidly transition low Earth orbit to commercial operations. In other words, we need to figure out how can NASA be a customer on commercial space stations in low Earth orbit rather than owning and operating the International Space Station. Now, I want to be really clear. The International Space Station has been a tremendous asset for the United States of America, and it will continue to be. The President's budget request called for a transition of the ISS in 2025. So that's 7 years from now. And the question between now and then is, what can we commercialize? And how do you create a business case for commercial entities in low Earth orbit? Could we take the International Space Station and enable private enterprise to, in essence, take it over and close the business case? And the answer is we don't know yet. And between now and 7 years from now, it may very well be possible. Additionally, we've got companies that are building commercial space stations, commercial habitats, that are going to be separate from the International Space Station. So that enables NASA to be a customer of those commercial space stations. Reducing our cost, we become one customer of many customers, and we have multiple providers that are competing on innovation and cost. So all of those things are good. So the commercialization of low Earth orbit, in my view, should be the highest priority so that we can take NASA resources and focus on going to the moon and creating a sustainable architecture at the moon to do science, but also to do prospecting, to take advantage of the hundreds of billions of tons of water ice that we now know is on the surface of the moon. That water ice on the moon represents life support. It's water to drink, hydrogen and oxygen. You split it into its component parts. It's air to breathe, but it also represents propulsion and power. Liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen is the same propellant that powered the space shuttles, for example. We want to use NASA resources to go further and do more than we've ever done before. To do that, we need to commercialize low Earth orbit. Now, if we want to extend the International Space Station, that's wonderful if we can have commercial enterprise do that. So the question is, what would that commercial enterprise be? There are a number of different companies right now that are making tremendous strides in manufacturing in low Earth orbit. The idea of manufacturing fiber optics, for example, is one commonly referred to capability. The idea that those fiber optics would be so pristine and so clear that you don't need cable repeaters, you don't need to make those massive investments every couple of miles or whatever the number is. And that closes the business case to manufacture in a microgravity environment fiber optics. The idea that in a microgravity environment, it's possible to, in essence, 3D print organs that can be used for humans, which is an astonishing kind of development that is being researched right now on the International Space Station. So there's so much more. Pharmaceuticals represents another great opportunity. So there's so many things that are being developed in this microgravity or almost zero gravity environment in low Earth orbit that could be commercialized. And if we can have that happen in the next 7 years and the NASA can use its resources to go further and do more, that's what we should be striving for.
The White House has reconstituted the National Space Council after it had been dormant for a long time, and its first directive was a return to the moon, which is, you've mentioned a few times.
Yes.
What is the architecture that's going to get us to the moon? What does it look like? How are we going to get there, and what's the timeline for that?
This show is, what, 4 hours long? No, I'll be brief. The reality is what we understand now because of reusable rockets, that we understand that the cost of getting to space and the access to space for more people is going to be better than ever before. That being the case, we want the entire architecture between the Earth and the moon to be reusable, as launch is now reusable. That being the case, we want tugs between low Earth orbit and lunar orbit to be reusable. We want a gateway, we call it the gateway. We think of a space station in orbit around the moon that's going to use solar electric propulsion, so it will be there for a very long period of time. But the key is it's got solar electric propulsion, so it's not only going to be in what we call a near rectilinear halo orbit, it's also going to be able to go to L1 and L2. It's in essence going to be able to go to more parts of the moon than ever before from an orbitology perspective. But we also want landers to be reusable. We want landers going back and forth from that space station in orbit around the moon, back and forth to the moon many, many times. If the entire architecture is reusable, then the entire architecture is sustainable. The president said in his space policy directive, he wants a sustainable return to the moon. He doesn't want to recreate Apollo with flags and footprints, and then in 1972, after our 6th landing on the moon, we came home and we never went back. He doesn't want to do that. He wants a sustainable architecture, and he wants to utilize the resources of the moon, the water ice that I mentioned. There could be, and we don't know, but there could be, rare earth metals on the moon. We talk about rare earth metals on Earth. Those aren't earth metals at all. Those are asteroid impacts from 1 billion years ago or more. Well, the moon has the same pot marks on the moon, but it doesn't have an active geology. The hydrosphere there is much less active than that on Earth, which means there could be massive deposits of rare earth metals, platinum group metals, if you will. They're not, of course, earth metals if they're on the moon, but that could be on the moon as well. So we need to prospect the moon. We need to understand it. There's a whole lot we don't know. From 1969 until 2008, most people believed that the moon was bone dry. 2008, the Indians made a discovery that there's water ice. 2009, NASA does its own research, discovers that there's hundreds of billions of tons of water ice at the poles of the moon. That should have changed our direction from a space perspective immediately. We should have been going back to the moon with a sustainable architecture to do the science, to do the discovery, and to ultimately be able to do more than we've ever done before. So the architecture not only gets us to the equatorial regions, which is what kind of Apollo did, it gets us to more parts of the moon than we've ever been to before, so we can make those discoveries. We should know a lot more about the moon today than we did, and we just haven't been doing it. The other thing that the moon represents, we talk about the gateway in orbit around the moon. That's to give us more access to more parts of the moon for a longer period of time than ever before. But the second gateway is a deep space transport. That's in essence our mission to Mars. So we want not only everything to be reusable, we want everything to be replicable for a Mars mission. And we want to take advantage of our commercial partners, as we've already discussed, and we want to take advantage of our international partners. So if we want to create the sustainable lunar architecture, again, we're not doing Apollo again. We're not going to, and I want to be clear, Apollo was amazing, critically important. We proved that the United States of America had a superior economic and political system, and we were superior technologically. We proved that. Now what we want to do is we want to be the only nation on the planet establishing a lunar architecture that is sustainable for the long run, that brings along with us all of our international partners and our commercial partners, again, to do more than we've ever done before. And all of this is about really one thing. That is improving the human condition on Earth. And that's what NASA's vision.
Before we wrap up, a quick word about the study of the sun that's going to take place with NASA.
A wonderful question. So the Parker Solar Probe is very soon going to launch, and this is going to enable us to know more about the sun. We talk about a Carrington level event. So a coronal mass ejection coming out of the sun. We're talking about charged particles coming out of the sun in mass quantities very, very fast. And that can damage humans in space because it's just a lot of radiation, if you will. On top of that, it can damage our satellites. It can mess with our power grid. A Carrington level event, which happened in the 1800s, if it happened today, it could be a civilization damaging kind of event. So we've got to be prepared for that. What we're going to understand with Parker Solar Probe is which is a mission to the sun, as you identify. It's crazy to think about, but a mission to the sun. We're going to work to be able to predict those kind of events and mitigate against them here on Earth.
Jim Bridenstine, the NASA administrator, joining us for this edition of Newsmakers. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. Christian Davenport from the administrators talk. Commercial came up time and again. It seems to be the name of the game at NASA. Did you walk away with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has come into office, and the Trump administration has really tried to embrace this growing space industry. You've heard the president talk about, these billionaires and their rockets, referring to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others. And, they're now providing a critical service for NASA, flying cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. But soon, as early as next year, NASA is going to be entrusting the lives of its astronauts to these companies, counting on them to fly to the International Space Station. But what was really interesting about what the administrator said was, Caleb asked a really smart question, I thought, about the Space Launch System. This is the massive rocket that Boeing and other more traditional companies are building, and it's come under real scrutiny because, A, of its cost and schedule delays, but also now that you've got this growing industry that are also building heavy lift rockets, what does it mean for the future of SLS? And he embraced that, given the chance. I mean, he said, no, we need that now, but he also left open the possibility that should other rockets come on the market, that he's all for an open competition between these companies, because in his view, that'll only benefit NASA.
And Mr. Henry, what else did you take away from those responses, particularly to the rocket side of it?
I thought his SLS comment was really important, certainly. Up until before SpaceX had launched their Falcon Heavy rocket this February, there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not SLS would be necessary, but you couldn't really compare it because neither rocket had flown. Now that Falcon Heavy has flown, you do have evidence of a heavy lift vehicle of that capability in the U.S. Alongside the Delta Heavy. But you've got strong rockets here, and the fact that NASA is willing to embrace those is certainly positive.
He talked about the confidence of putting humans into these rockets. Is that an accurate reflection? Is NASA confident in the ability of these commercial rockets to safely carry people to space?
I believe yes. NASA's standards are world renowned. They're very serious about safety. I think it was really interesting hearing about his experience being a pilot. It's certainly top of mind, safety of the astronauts, and these companies are being put through rigorous tests to make sure that their vehicles are up to par. Mr.
Davenport?
Yeah, well, they don't have a choice. I mean, these contracts are out the door. The spacecraft are being developed. Right now, NASA does not have the ability to fly astronauts into space, and hasn't had that capability since 2011 when the space shuttle was retired. A lot of people don't realize NASA's astronauts still fly to space. They still go to the International Space Station, but they do it on Russian rockets. Now, Boeing and SpaceX are trying to restore that capability for NASA and are developing their vehicles, but the programs have been delayed. But right now, NASA doesn't have a choice. They've got to get these spacecraft and these rockets up and running.
He spoke in optimistic terms of going to the moon, going to Mars. What's the reality of either of those things happening?
The Mars is always, 20 to 30 years down the road, and it's been that way for a long time. I think a return to the moon is more realistic. But whether, when I asked the question about it, we didn't get a real sense of the timeline and when this is going to happen. I mean, they talk about putting a propulsion element of this gateway up in the early 2020s, and I know they're working on a lunar lander proposal now. It does seem like it's a more achievable and reasonable goal, and the way they're thinking about it, again, as the administrator said, is not to just go there, touch the moon, walk around on it, and leave, but to build a sustainable architecture so that you can actually stay there and be there, for some time, just as we have a presence in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station. Extend that to the region of the moon.
And Mr. Henry, he talked a little bit about the future relations we'll have with Russia and China, especially as we take on more of an American role. What's the reality of the future of relations with those countries, particularly when it comes to space?
So, as you mentioned, the space has been a special area that has been carved out when there are tough times, and the U.S.-Russia relationship in space has been very strong. He is talking positively about making the Lunar Gateway something that also has a lot of international representation, but I think it's clear that international partners are concerned that America is much more concerned focused on going alone, and he's certainly spoken against that. But when I've talked to people in the European industry, the Europeans work very closely with NASA and space, and they've definitely evidenced some concerns about whether or not the U.S. will shed some of the responsibilities that they've worked with on others.
Caleb Henry is a staff writer for Space News, and Christian Davenport is the Space and Defense Industries reporter for the Washington Post. To both of you, thanks for joining us on Newsmakers.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.